The first thing I heard that morning was not birds or wind or the sound of my coffee machine finishing its last sputter of effort. It was metal scraping against metal, that harsh, nervous little screech that makes every instinct in your body sit up and pay attention, and for a second I thought some idiot was trying to pry open my truck door with a screwdriver. So I stepped out onto the porch, mug in my hand, steam curling up into the cool, quiet air, and there she was, HOA Karen in all her fluorescent glory, bent over my driver's side door like she was disarming a bomb instead of attacking a pickup truck with what she proudly believed was a master key. She had her hair pulled back into this tight, shiny helmet bun, her favorite visor clipped on like she was about to referee a game no one else agreed to play, and in her hand a bright brass key flashed in the early light as she jabbed it into my lock again and again with frantic determination. Each failed twist made her jaw tighten more, and the way she leaned her shoulder into it, you would think my truck had personally offended her ancestors. I stood there for a moment just watching the scene unfold, because there are levels of wrong, and this one needed a second to sink in. She had not knocked on my door, she had not asked me anything, she had not sent one of her passive-aggressive faux official notices first. She had walked straight onto my property, straight up to my truck, and decided today was the day she broke into a law enforcement vehicle in the name of community harmony. I cleared my throat and her whole body jolted like I had blown an air horn behind her. She spun around, clutching the key in front of her like a badge of honor. Her eyes went wide with outrage, not guilt, outrage, as if I had intruded on her crime scene instead of the other way around. "There you are," she snapped, as if I had kept her waiting all morning. "All vehicles in this neighborhood must allow emergency HOA access. Your refusal is highly suspicious." I took a sip of coffee, mostly to buy myself a second, because there are a lot of ways to respond when someone accuses you of suspicious behavior while actively trying to unlock your truck, and most of them end with paperwork. She glared at me like I was already convicted and sentenced. Then, without waiting for so much as a hello, she turned her shoulder toward me and jabbed the key into the lock again. When it refused to cooperate, she gasped with theatrical shock like the truck had insulted her personally. "This key is universal," she hissed. "It works on every compliant vehicle in the community." Apparently my truck had missed the orientation. She yanked the key out, stepped back a pace, and glanced at me with narrowed eyes, assessing, weighing, inventing a story faster than she could breathe. I had seen that look before, years of dealing with people who believed that confidence could make fiction into fact. I opened my mouth to ask what exactly she thought she was doing, but I never got the chance because she snapped into action, like a director calling the next scene. She whipped her phone from her pocket, hit 3 numbers, and lifted it to her ear with one smooth, dramatic motion. "Yes, hello," she said in that falsely calm tone people use when they are about to exaggerate something into the stratosphere. "I would like to report a non-compliant male refusing a mandatory HOA safety inspection on his vehicle." She jabbed a finger toward me for emphasis, as if the dispatcher we could see through the phone. "He is preventing required access and acting suspiciously." I stood there on my own front porch in my sleep shirt and boots, one hand holding a mug of coffee, the other resting on the railing, and apparently this was what suspicious looked like in Karen land. She paced in a tight little circle while she talked, painting herself as the guardian of order, describing my truck like it was some rogue tank parked in a preschool drop-off lane. She left out one tiny detail, though: the non-compliant male she was reporting to emergency services was the county sheriff off duty. Sure, but still the sheriff, the same sheriff whose badge was painted neatly on the cruiser parked in plain sight on the other side of the driveway, the same sheriff whose name and job she had absolutely seen on the mailbox more than once. I did not interrupt her call, because there are times when you learn more by listening than by correcting, and besides, I already knew the recording would be useful later. She paced and talked and performed, clutching that brass key at her side like a sacred artifact from the Temple of Overreach. "There is a vehicle," she continued, "that refuses universal access standards, and the owner is becoming increasingly uncooperative." I raised an eyebrow because I had not spoken a single word yet. Apparently silence had upgraded to hostility in her mind. She ended the call with a satisfied little humph, like she had just saved a bus full of schoolchildren instead of misusing emergency services over a lock that did not belong to her. The moment the call ended, she turned to me with that smug, tight smile she reserved for people she believed were about to learn a lesson the hard way. "You should have complied from the beginning," she said. "HOA protocol requires cooperation. Your behavior is extremely concerning." And of course, she said protocol like there was a national manual stored in a vault somewhere instead of a set of neighborhood guidelines she usually twisted into whatever shape suited her obsession of the week. I set my mug on the porch rail and walked down the steps, slowly, not rushing, not looming, not raising my voice. After years in uniform, you learn the power of calm. The more someone else flails, the more your stillness unsettles them. Karen watched every step I took, weighting them with suspicion, like each footfall spelled out defiance in big red letters. She clutched the key harder, and for a second I thought she would try to shove it into the lock again, as if my presence were a minor inconvenience. I stopped on the edge of the gravel where driveway met yard, close enough to smell her citrusy perfume, sharp enough to cut through the crisp morning air. Closer now, I could see The key more clearly. It was not some official device, not some standardized emergency tool, just a regular brass key with master etched into the handle in cheap engraving like something sold in a novelty aisle on clearance, and somehow in her mind, that label gave her jurisdiction over every door it failed to open before she could launch into another speech. I said her name slow, steady. Karen. She flinched at the sound, not because she was guilty but because being addressed by name shifted the scene in her head. She was no longer the anonymous hero giving testimony to invisible authorities. She was a neighbor standing in the middle of someone else's driveway, clutching evidence of her own overreach. The silence between us stretched for a beat, only the sound of a distant lawn sprinkler ticking away and a bird complaining from a nearby tree. She straightened her shoulders, tried to reclaim the script. You have an obligation to support community safety, she insisted. This master key. The program exists for the protection of all residents. I asked a simple question, the kind that sounds harmless until it lands. Who approved that program? Her mouth opened, then stalled like a car that just missed a gear. She waved the key vaguely. HOA policy, she declared. Board initiative. Written and adopted. Her eyes flicked away for the briefest moment, which told me everything I needed to know, because I had already read those bylaws front to back and there was absolutely nothing in them about master keys to private vehicles. She did what people like her always do when fact wobbles under their feet. She doubled down. The board is fully aware, she added, choosing careful words that could mean almost anything in the moment but nothing on paper. Eyes bright with defiance, she planted her hands on her hips and stared at my truck again, like sheer willpower could force the lock to surrender. Meanwhile, somewhere on the other end of that dispatch call, a patrol car was being rerouted for a suspicious male resisting an inspection, and I knew exactly how that scene was going to unfold. The responding deputy would roll up, see me, recognize his boss, and spend the rest of the interaction trying very hard not to laugh. I almost felt bad for Karen for the exact second before I remembered the runway of fake citations already stacked in a binder in my office. I watched her fuss and mutter and reposition herself between my truck and the street like a human barrier between civilization and chaos, and as ridiculous as it looked, I also knew something else. This morning was not a random outburst, this was escalation. This was a person who had decided that her need for control outweighed common sense, property lines, and actual law. Lifted my mug again, tasted the last lukewarm sip, and made a decision in that small, quiet moment between one heartbeat and the next. I stopped seeing her as an annoying neighbor and started seeing her as a problem I might eventually have to handle, not as a homeowner, as a sheriff. The strange thing about people like Karen is that once they decide the world should operate according to their personal list of unwritten rules, they lose all fear of consequences, and that was exactly the stage she had entered back when I first moved into the cul-de-sac, long before the master key fiasco became her newest crusade and turned my mornings into neighborhood theater at sunrise. Because the truth is, Karen didn't become this unhinged overnight. No, she had been training for this moment for years, rehearsing every glare, every clipboard tap, every overly official phrase in the mirror, until she convinced herself that she was not just the HOA president, but some kind of suburban guardian sworn to protect the aesthetic, the balance of driveways and trash bins and mailbox colors. When I moved in, she saw the patrol cruiser in my driveway and reacted like I had parked a tank on her flower bed. She marched right up the day after I unloaded the last moving box and introduced herself, not with a welcome greeting or a plate of cookies, but with a complaint. She announced that law enforcement vehicles could create unnecessary alarm, which was her polite way of telling me my cruiser clashed with the neighborhood vibe. I remember staring at her, trying to process the logic, because last time I checked, crime prevention wasn't something you hid behind a hedge. I told her calmly that my cruiser was legally parked, legally registered, and not subject to HOA regulation, especially since my property sat technically outside her jurisdiction. That word technically hung in the air, like the scent of gasoline before a match hit it, because nothing infuriated her more than realizing she could see something but couldn't control it. She left my driveway stiff and offended, and the next morning, I found my first fake citation tucked under my windshield wiper, a pastel pink slip printed with the words, "Unauthorized government imagery visible from public view," as if the sheriff emblem was some kind of offensive graphic worthy of censorship. I peeled it off, laughed, tossed it in a drawer, and went on with my day, not knowing that drawer would eventually become a binder, and then multiple binders, filled with every bizarre offense she dreamed up. She fined me for tire tracks after rain, calling it unauthorized terrain modification. Another day she accused me of reflective aggression because the sun bounced off my chrome grille at the wrong angle, apparently blinding her. During her mid-morning walk, she even knocked on my door once with a photo of my truck's shadow stretched across my driveway, pointing at it like she had discovered evidence of a crime. Shadows should not extend beyond 4.5 feet, she said with the seriousness of someone reciting legal code. Did she measure it? Of course she did. She carried a retractable tape measure like some women carry lipstick, and she documented that shadow like she was submitting it to the Supreme Court. Still, despite all the absurd fines, the printed threats, the early morning door knocks, the clipboard tapping, the foot stomping, the emails written in all caps, the moment everything truly shifted, the moment her obsession found its center, was the day she requested a copy of my keys. She delivered that request like a surgeon asking for a scalpel, matter of fact, emotionless, and with complete expectation that I would comply. She stated that every responsible neighbor should provide the HOA with an emergency access key for safety protocols. I stared at her, wondering if it was a joke, if there was a hidden camera somewhere, or if this woman genuinely believed she had the authority to access private property whenever she pleased. So I told her no firmly, clearly, and without apology. The look she gave me was not anger, it was disbelief, like I had refused a sacred oath she considered herself entitled to. She blinked 3 times, lifted her chin, and informed me that she would be revisiting the matter, which was Karen code for obsessing about it until she found a way to force her will onto the situation. After that, her citations increased, her meetings grew more dramatic, her morning patrols intensified. She began organizing what she called community safety walks, where she strolled through the cul-de-sac at random hours, looking for violations and pretending to answer calls through a fake earpiece. She liked to tap as if she was in contact with some imaginary command center. She even tried to convince several neighbors that my truck was too authoritative, too large, too official, and therefore destabilizing to the neighborhood. Aesthetic. One poor guy believed her for a day and asked me if I could maybe park it farther back on the driveway so it didn't intimidate his kids. I had to explain gently that my truck wasn't haunted or threatening, it was just a truck, but Karen had a talent for creating paranoia where none existed, and her confidence in her own fantasies only grew over time. The more pushback she received, the more her delusions inflated. She believed she was protecting the community from an uprising of unruly vehicles, and she saw herself as the last line of defense, armed with nothing but clipboards, highlighters, and laminated rule sheets she wrote herself. And so the day she stood in my driveway, trying to unlock my truck with a brass key, wasn't a sudden explosion. It was an inevitable collision between her growing sense of authority and the hard reality she refused to acknowledge. She had spent years crafting a world where she was the enforcer, the judge, the jury, the architect of order, and my refusal to hand over my keys rattled something in her foundation. It threatened the illusion she had built that she controlled everything within her line of sight, and that realization pushed her into increasingly ridiculous stunts, because to her, every no was not a boundary, it was a challenge, a personal insult, a rebellion against the harmony she imagined she was upholding. She told neighbors I was resistant, told others I was suspicious, told a few that my truck was displaying signs of non-cooperative energy, whatever that meant, and she truly believed all these warnings were justified, because deep down Karen didn't just want compliance, she wanted submission. She wanted everyone in the neighborhood to acknowledge her authority, including me, and when she didn't get it, her desperation grew, her tactics sharpened, and her fantasies expanded until she found herself standing on my driveway with a shiny brass key, believing wholeheartedly that she had the right to open a law enforcement vehicle, all because she had decided it should be that way. What she didn't know, what she couldn't accept, was that her obsession was no longer harmless irritation. It was drifting steadily into legal territory, and the moment she called 911 on me, convinced she was enforcing safety, she set a chain of events into motion that neither of us could undo, but only one of us would walk away from with authority intact. In part 3 we'll show you exactly how far she went once that master key failed and humiliation became fuel for her next wave of chaos. By the time the master key incident blew up in her face and the responding deputy realized the suspicious non-compliant male she had reported was in fact his boss, Karen didn't retreat the way a reasonable person might once humiliated publicly. No, Karen absorbed humiliation like oxygen. It didn't slow her down, it powered her, and the very next morning she launched a full-scale campaign that proved she had moved beyond petty HOA nonsense and crossed into something far more theatrical and far more concerning, because at sunrise, before the birds even bothered to start complaining, I walked out with my coffee and froze halfway down the porch steps. Not because of noise or shouting this time, but because my driveway had transformed overnight into what looked like a homemade airport runway. She had planted neon orange flags in 2 perfect straight rows leading from the street all the way to the front of my truck, each one spaced like she had measured with a laser level, each one carrying a printed label reading claim, pending vehicle access gate under review. And to top it off, the footprints around the flags were unmistakably hers, those wide flat indentations from orthopedic sandals that she wore like armor against common sense. I crouched down, picked up one of the flags, and stared at the message again, wondering what dimension you had to live in to believe you could install a gate on property outside your authority and then announce it with arts and crafts supplies, as if those bright little flags granted her the jurisdiction she desperately craved. The sun was barely cresting over the roofs when I heard the familiar clack 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 of her sandals, approaching with the prideful rhythm of someone arriving to admire their masterpiece. Karen stood at the edge of the driveway, hands on hips, sunglasses perched on her nose as if she was surveying a construction site. She owned "Good morning," she said with that brittle politeness she used the way some people use pepper spray. I held up one of the flags and asked her plainly, "Did you put these here?" She lifted her chin like a judge addressing a courtroom of children. "Of course I did. The HOA has initiated a vehicle access evaluation. Your truck poses unresolved compliance concerns, and these markers designate the future inspection zone." I swallowed the urge to laugh because that reaction wouldn't help and instead asked, "What authority gives you the right to plant anything on my property?" She gave the answer only Karen could give with a straight face. Property lines are fluid in matters of community safety, fluid as if boundaries were optional and reality was something she could rewrite with a clipboard. She insisted the board voted unanimously to approve her actions, which would have sounded compelling if I hadn't already heard from multiple board members that they avoided her the way people avoid poison ivy. But she lived in her own world where unanimous in spirit meant unanimous in her imagination, and she stood there proudly inspecting her orange runway, like she expected applause. I looked at her, took a slow breath, and reminded her she was trespassing, but she waved her hand dismissively and said a phrase that told me everything she planned: to build an amendment to expand HOA authority to all vehicles within visual proximity of the neighborhood, even those outside the boundary of enforcement, which, in other words, meant my truck. She believed she could rewrite legal jurisdiction just by typing it on letterhead. It was then I realized she wasn't improvising anymore. She was planning, and people who plan this deeply while ignoring reality are always heading toward a collision with consequences she can't foresee. I documented the entire setup from every angle: photos of the flags, her footprints, the spacing, the placement, the labels, because part of being a sheriff isn't waiting for trouble, it's seeing it forming and preparing before it arrives, and trouble was marching across my driveway in sandals the second she left my property, muttering about rogue vehicles and community harmony. My neighbor Mark texted me a photo of his own mailbox plastered in pink flyers warning about a non-compliant truck threatening neighborhood stability. She had escalated from individual harassment to full propaganda campaign. The flyers demanded residents vote for universal HOA access credentials to all cars, which was her fancy way of describing her desire to hold the entire neighborhood's keys like some self-appointed gatekeeper of freedom. By afternoon, she had taped flyers to trash cans, lampposts, and even the community bulletin board at the mail station, complete with glitter accents and tiny hand-drawn stars, as if decorating a birthday card for a toddler. When I returned home later that day, I found yet another notice under my windshield wiper, printed on neon yellow paper, reading, "Notice of parking violation, excessive vehicle presence," which was her dramatic way of saying my truck existed on my driveway, which she hated. I placed that notice in the binder with the rest fully aware it would not be the last, because the more resistance she faced, the more she inflated her sense of authority. And by the time evening rolled in, she had organized an emergency meeting which one of the neighbors filmed and sent to me. The footage was an unintentional comedy special. She stood at the front of the rec room in a blazer, holding a laser pointer like a TED Talk speaker, and presented a slideshow depicting my truck as the #1 threat to community stability. One slide was a blurry, low-angle photo of my truck, taken like she was filming a documentary on dangerous wildlife. Another listed potential threat indicators, including size, color, reflectiveness, law enforcement, symbolism, and owner non-compliance. She concluded the presentation by declaring the HOA must take immediate action to restore driveway harmony and urged the community to prepare for stricter vehicular regulation. Her voice shook with conviction, like she believed she was rallying troops for a suburban revolution. At the end of the meeting, one brave resident timidly raised a hand and asked, "Isn't that the sheriff's truck?" And Karen responded with the confidence of someone who had never been wrong in her own mind, "Authority does not exempt anyone from community standards," which would have been hilarious if it wasn't so deeply disconnected from reality. The next morning, when I stepped outside, I found not one, not two, but 3 new violations taped to my truck: reflective paint disturbance, unauthorized law enforcement symbols, and driveway shadow imbalance. She was now policing shadows again, and that was when the truth settled in like a weight. Karen wasn't just irritated or nosy or stubborn. She was obsessed with control, obsessed with my truck, obsessed with the idea that the HOA was her kingdom and every driveway a subject she was losing grip on. An obsession like that never fades quietly. It sharpens, it escalates. And as I stood staring at those 3 new violations fluttering in the morning breeze, I realized she had officially crossed into dangerous territory, and this time she wasn't just provoking a neighbor, she was provoking the law. And in part 4, you will see exactly how far she pushes this obsession and how the neighborhood gets dragged into the chaos she unleashes next. The day after the slideshow fiasco, I half expected Karen to show up in a reflective vest and whistle, demanding everyone attend synchronized driveway drills, because that was the natural trajectory of her behavior. But even I wasn't prepared for what she did next, because obsession doesn't just grow in a straight line, it mutates, it spreads, it reaches for new places to latch onto, and Karen latched onto my truck like it was the final boss in a video game. She couldn't win unless she created a new rulebook of her own making. And so early that next morning, I stepped outside with a naive hope that maybe, just maybe, after embarrassing herself with color-coded slides and unhinged charts, she would take a day off from policing shadows and imaginary laws. But the universe wasn't feeling generous, because the moment I reached my truck, my brain rejected what my eyes were seeing: a heavy, bright yellow wheel clamp locked onto my front tire like some medieval torture device for vehicles thick metal jaws gripping the rubber so tightly that I immediately checked for damage. Not because I cared about the clamp, but because if she would scratch my rim, I was going to have to file twice as many reports as I already planned to. And hanging from the clamp was a laminated tag, of course laminated, that read HOA impound non-compliant vehicle with a neatly itemized release fee of $390. As if she was running a municipal impound lot from her Prius. I set my mug on the hood and crouched down, examining the clamp, running my fingers along the heavy steel because this wasn't some flimsy prop from a Halloween costume. This was real, solid, the kind of device only official parking authorities were allowed to use, which meant Karen had gone online, Googled car boot for sale, and bought the first thing with 5-star reviews, despite having absolutely zero legal authority to attach it to anyone's property, especially not a law enforcement vehicle sitting on a driveway outside her jurisdiction. And I was still processing that level of insanity when I heard the unmistakable shuffle of those cursed sandals, that clack-clack shuffle that signaled nonsense was approaching at full speed. And sure enough, she rounded the corner with pride, puffing her chest out like she had just thwarted a major crime. Her arms crossed, clipboard tucked tight to her ribs. Like a holy relic, today you learn to respect community. Authority, she declared, as if I had been waiting for enlightenment from her. Not drinking coffee on my own porch for the past 20 minutes, I stood slowly, feeling the calm settle into my bones, because the calmer I got, the more unhinged she became, and I wanted every word she said to be something I could quote. Later she told me the truck wasn't mine anymore, that once a vehicle became a threat to harmony, it became a community-adjacent asset subject to oversight, which was a poetic but utterly fictional phrase she had clearly invented in the shower that morning. And I explained once again that this was private property and she had no legal grounds for immobilizing anything. But she waved off my words like they were gnats buzzing around her mission. She claimed she had authority under spirit off-the-board guidelines, whatever spiritual legislation that was, and she insisted I'd pay the release fee like everyone else, which was impressive considering no one else in the history of this neighborhood had ever been booted in their own driveway, because no one else had ever triggered her spiral into vehicular tyranny. I asked her calmly to remove the device. She refused. I asked again. She refused harder. Then she escalated to dramatic outrage, shouting that I was intimidating her through presence alone, which was wild considering she was the one who shackled my truck like a stolen getaway car. I pulled out my phone, not for drama but for documentation, and her eyes widened because footage was her kryptonite. She hated evidence. She couldn't rewrite. She scoffed and said photos wouldn't scare her, but she visibly panicked when I dialed the non-emergency line and requested a deputy since I couldn't legally handle an incident involving myself at the moment. The cruiser rolled around the corner. I saw the exact second she realized she had a problem. Deputy Hernandez stepped out, took one look at the clamp, then at me, then at her, and his expression carried the unmistakable weight of a man who had seen enough of Karen to know he needed to mentally clock out before his shift actually ended. Karen rushed to him like he was her backup. She demanded he arrest me for refusing to comply with HOA impoundment protocol. He blinked and said carefully, "Ma'am, there is no HOA impoundment protocol," but she insisted she had created one, and he reminded her that creating laws in your living room didn't make them enforceable in the real world. When he asked where she got the clamp, she proudly admitted she bought it online because it came in colors like that made it legal. Hernandez told her she had tampered with property she didn't own. She gasped at the accusation like he'd insulted her honor, and declared she was being oppressed by the sheriff's office, which was bold considering she was currently standing beside a wheel clamp she illegally installed on the sheriff's truck. Hernandez issued her a formal warning and ordered her to remove it immediately. She refused again, so he informed her that if she didn't remove it, the department would, and something about the tone of that sentence finally cracked her defiance. She stomped over, muttering about rogue vehicles and interference, and wrestled the clamp off with enough dramatic flair to win a daytime soap award. She dragged it back to her Prius like she was withdrawing troops from a battlefield and peeled away, leaving a cloud of indignation behind her. But humiliation didn't slow her down. It fueled her, because by that afternoon the entire neighborhood found glossy brochures taped to their doors and mailboxes, each one printed on thick paper as if she believed higher quality cardstock improved legality. The front read, "The Great Vehicle Harmony Initiative," and inside was a list of proposed rules so absurdly detailed it felt like reading the bylaws of a dystopian parking dictatorship. She wanted mandatory key access for all cars, HOA-controlled driveway rotation schedules, monthly silhouette compliance checks, and fines for visually disruptive automobile posture, whatever posture meant in her mind. She had become more than president. She was metamorphosed into a neighborhood emperor armed with clipboards and delusion, and while some neighbors laughed, others worried, because Karen wielded confidence with the force of a bulldozer, and fear is easy to manipulate, especially when delivered with laminated conviction. By the time evening arrived, I had 13 new violations taped to my truck, ranging from insufficient tire humility to reflective hostility to owner attitude non-compliance, each more unhinged than the last. And as I gathered them into the binder, I realized she was no longer harassing me. She was conditioning the neighborhood, and if Part 5 showed anything, it was that this wasn't just spiraling, it was accelerating straight toward the point where the entire community finally snapped and decided they were done living under the rule of a one-woman parking dictatorship. By the time I tucked the 13th violation of the day into the growing binder, the neighborhood's patience, already stretched thinner than the tape she used to post her flyers, finally began to fray. And that evening, as the sun dipped low and cast orange light across the cul-de-sac, something shifted in the air, a quiet ripple of collective exhaustion turning into collective resolve because people were no longer laughing Karen off as the quirky, overzealous HOA president. No, they were fed up, embarrassed, and increasingly worried she would start regulating the angle of their garage doors or the emotional energy of their porch lights. And that was the moment the board members, worn down and hollow-eyed, knocked on my door like soldiers seeking refuge after a long battle with bureaucracy in sandals. The oldest board member, Jill, spoke first in the tired whisper of someone who had been pushed past the point of politeness. She asked if I could attend the Friday HOA meeting, not as sheriff, but as the neighbor who had been targeted the longest, the one who had what she called unparalleled documentation, which was a polite way of saying you have receipts for every insane thing she's done, and we need them because we are finally ready to remove her. They told me the board was fractured for years, but Karen's recent meltdown had united them with the desperation of people clinging to the last lifeboat on a sinking ship. So I agreed to attend and help set up early, and by the time Friday arrived, the community center felt like a courtroom, disguised as a multi-purpose room, metal chairs lined in uneven rows, the faint smell of burnt coffee drifting from a dusty brewer, and neighbors gathering in clusters clutching their own violations, like evidence they were afraid she'd steal back to rewrite. And the atmosphere hummed like everyone had been waiting months for this moment. The room filled faster than any meeting I had seen before. Teenagers sat on the floor, retirees stood in the back, and everyone seemed to share the same expression: tired, irritated, and almost giddy with anticipation. Because they knew today was the day the clipboard queen faced her reckoning. Exactly 12 minutes before the meeting officially began, the door swung open hard, enough to rattle the frame, and in marched Karen, wearing her navy blazer like a coronation robe, her fake earpiece blinking with an LED she added for dramatic effect, and her precious clipboard hugged to her chest like a sacred artifact. She moved with the self-importance of someone entering her own inauguration, ignoring the groans muttered under breaths as she announced there will be order tonight, even though the meeting hadn't started and she no longer possessed the authority to demand order from a folding chair. But Karen never operated on actual authority. She operated on imagined authority. So she walked straight up to the podium and prepared to hijack the evening until Jill stepped in with the firmness of a woman who had reached the absolute limit of what she was willing to tolerate from a person who had once fined her for having emotionally aggressive mulch. Jill told her the board would run the meeting and Karen needed to sit down, and the silence that followed hit the room like a lightning strike, because no one had ever told Karen to sit before, not directly, not publicly, not with witnesses, and she did not know how to process that command for a full 5 seconds. She stood stock still, like her brain was buffering. Then, with a huff that sounded like a deflating pool toy, she stomped into a metal chair and sat, arms crossed, knees stiff, chin high, as if sitting were part of her master plan all along. Jill started the meeting with calm authority, outlining the agenda and thanking residents for coming. Before moving into the real reason for the gathering, the board was formally addressing the concerning actions of Karen Allen, which in HOA language was the equivalent of saying we're finally done with this madness and it's go time. They listed unauthorized fines, harassment, repeated boundary violations, the creation of fake councils, and initiatives, attempts to collect money through fraudulent QR codes, and escalating interference in private property. Karen erupted mid-sentence, shouting lies, but Jill hit her with the sharpest quiet sit I had ever heard, and Karen sat again like gravity had betrayed her. That was my cue. I stepped to the front, folder in hand, and introduced myself not as sheriff but as the neighbor who had been the primary target of Karen's crusade for far too long. Then I laid it all out, not loud, not emotional, just with the precision that comes from years of writing reports that must stand up in court. I showed the photos of her trying to open my truck with the so-called master key. I played the audio of her calling 911 and describing me as a suspicious male refusing her inspection. I held up the dozens of fake citations she left on my cruiser and truck, fines for reflective hostility, terrain modification, and unauthorized shadow length. I displayed the runway of neon flags she planted for her fictional vehicle gate, her clamped the tow truck. She summoned the barricade she built in the middle of my driveway like she was controlling a checkpoint in a war zone. Neighbors gasped, some cursed under their breath, others nodded with vindication, as they realized their experiences with her were part of a larger pattern of delusion and control. When I showed the Mobility Harmony Initiative pamphlet with her PayPal link on the back, a wave of outrage moved through the room, because that was the moment everyone understood this wasn't just annoying behavior anymore. It was deceptive, it was manipulative, and it was potentially criminal. I closed the folder and stepped aside, and the room fell into a tense, charged silence. Then one board member rose and said the words everyone had been waiting to hear for months. We moved to vote on the immediate removal of Karen Allen as HOA president, and before the sentence even finished, hands shot into the air like the crowd had rehearsed it. Dozens of hands, dozens of fed-up homeowners, every single hand but Karen's, which she thrust upward like a lone rebel in a collapsing empire. Jill asked, all opposed, and her solitary hand trembled in the air like it knew resistance was now futile. The vote passed unanimously, and just like that, the woman who had ruled the neighborhood with clipboards and chaos lost her crown in front of the entire community. Karen leapt to her feet, shouting that the neighborhood would collapse without her, that she was the final defender of harmony, that we were all blind to the vehicular uprising brewing around us. She grabbed her clipboard like a shield, stormed out, and slammed the door so hard the wall trembled, leaving behind a room full of relieved, exhausted residents who finally realized they were free. But as the applause swelled and people began celebrating the end of her reign, I stayed quiet because I knew something they didn't, something that sat heavy in my gut like a storm front building on the horizon. Karen was many things, but defeated wasn't one of them, and Part 6 would reveal exactly how far she was willing to go once she realized she could no longer control the neighborhood she had ruled with laminated terror. The thing about storms is that they don't always hit when the clouds gather. Sometimes they hit after the sky turns quiet again, after everyone starts to relax, believing the worst has passed, and that's exactly what happened in the days after. Karen was voted out because the neighborhood melted into a kind of peace we hadn't felt in months. People took walks without fear of being cited for aggressive footstep rhythm. Someone washed their car in broad daylight with music playing like they were testing the limits of freedom. Toddlers rode plastic tricycles down driveways that had previously been accused of harboring rebellious energy, and the air itself felt lighter, as if the absence of her sandals clacking had lifted a pressure only she created. But while the neighborhood celebrated, I didn't mistake her silence for surrender, because I had been in law enforcement long enough to know that people like Karen don't just vanish. They regroup, they reorganize, they reinvent the very structure of their delusion and return, wearing a new title with even greater confidence. And that ominous little truth proved itself just 3 days after her removal, when a soft thud in my mailbox delivered the next stage of her chaos. Wrapped in linen textured envelopes that screamed unnecessary formality, I flipped it over, examined the embossed return label, which read Bluff County Oversight Initiative, which was a fancy title she clearly created during an evening meltdown fueled by spite and hype. And inside the envelope was a letter dripping with self-importance, demanding that I attend a mandatory mediation session to discuss my ongoing vehicle compliance concerns, which was astonishing, considering she no longer held any position of authority. What delusion made her bold? And the letter ended with threats of further action which she didn't have the authority to pursue, and a QR code linking to yet another PayPal account, this time labeled Bluff Community Harmony Fund. And I laughed, because it was either laugh or frame the letter next to the wheel clamp as proof of just how far she had drifted from reality. But before I could even sit down to reread it, my doorbell rang and my son stepped in, carrying his own cup of coffee, shaking his head as he handed me several complaints that had been dropped off at the sheriff's office by neighbors receiving identical letters. He sighed the way only someone who grew up watching me deal with 12 flavors of ridiculous could sigh, and said with the kind of calm that warned trouble is coming, "She's escalating into criminal territory, Dad." And he wasn't wrong, because impersonating government oversight, even fake government oversight, is a legal line she was towing with the enthusiasm of someone convinced reality would bend for her. Then, that same night, as I was settling into the quiet of the porch reading under the soft glow of the overhead light, my motion sensor clicked on, and when I checked the camera feed expecting raccoons or deer, maybe a stray cat, what stared back at me in green-tinted night vision made me mutter a prayer for patience, because there she was, Karen, standing at the exact border of my property, a reflective vest glowing in the infrared, her posture rigid, her stance deliberate, measuring tape dangling from one hand, clipboard in the other. She wasn't moving, she wasn't trespassing technically, she was just standing, as if guarding the border, as if waiting for divine HOA permission to cross. She stayed there still as a fence post for nearly 10 minutes before turning and disappearing into the darkness like a low-budget vigilante. And the next morning, multiple neighbors found the same linen envelopes, the same threats, the same absurdity, and by noon I had collected enough identical letters to wallpaper a room and forwarded them straight to Deputy Hernandez. He called with the calm tone of someone who had to reread something 7 times just to accept it was real, and it informed me that yes, we now had enough to open an investigation into attempted fraud, because Karen wasn't just playing HOA anymore. She was trying to create an entire regulatory agency in her living room using clipboards, a printer, and misguided determination. The meltdown I expected came faster than I thought, because that afternoon, while I was working in the garage, I heard a commotion and stepped out to find Karen in full theatrical rebellion, standing beside her Prius, waving an enormous poster like a battle flag, shrieking about how my truck was destabilizing the community. The poster was a blown-up satellite image of the neighborhood, with my truck circled in thick red marker and surrounded by words like unknown vehicle energy zone and driveway dominance hazard. A kid passing by with a scooter whispered, "Is he a superhero?" And Karen snapped around, declaring, "Absolutely not, he is a menace," which was apparently her new word of the week. This was The scene Hernandez pulled up on two cruisers sliding to a stop as Karen straightened up, puffing her chest like she expected he was arriving to congratulate her on heroic oversight operations instead. He stepped forward and calmly served her formal papers outlining harassment, impersonation of an authority figure, attempted fraud, and violation of the cease and desist order she had been given earlier. Her face went from triumph to betrayal in 1 second, and she shrieked that she was the initiative. She was the harmony. She was the only one preventing vehicular uprising in the suburbs, and Hernandez, bless him, calmly reminded her that nothing she created was real and she had no authority beyond her imagination. She ranted, she yelled, she accused the sheriff's office of staging a conspiracy against her clipboard mission, and when she finally ran out of breath, she threw herself into her Prius and sped off without looking back. And for the first time since this nightmare began, she stayed gone. Days passed, then weeks. The neighborhood learned how to exist without laminated fear tactics. People joked about starting a Karen recovery support group. Kids chalked the sidewalks with messages like "Be kind, not Karen." And for the first time ever, my driveway felt like mine again. But peace isn't the end of stories with people like her. It's just the intermission, and that truth hit months later when Tanya from the county clerk's office knocked on my door with a folder containing recently filed documents for a brand new HOA 30 miles south, incomplete but legible, and one name was printed in bold: proposed HOA president, Karen Allen. I closed the folder slowly, and Tanya asked if I'd warned the new neighborhood, but I shook my head because some lessons aren't taught, they're experienced, and Karen would always find a way to carry her clipboard into the next chapter of her own chaos. And as I sat on my porch later that evening, mug in hand, watching the quiet, peaceful stretch of road that had finally recovered from the storm, I realized something important. People like her don't stop, they just relocate. But people like me don't stop either, and if the next neighborhood ever needed the truth, they knew exactly where to find the man with the binders, the truck, and the patience to survive a war waged by a woman armed with sandals, a visor, and a determination to control every inch of a world that never belonged to her in the first place.